Hello everyone, Darkabald Trades here. Now, I've been looking for the best arguments for theism, and last week I tackled the first position from a video titled Convince Atheists by Using 3 Best Theist Positions, from a channel called Atheist vs. Theist. Well, the first position was about how the universe was strangely empty, and that aliens should be visiting us. Basically the Fermi paradox, but put forth pretty awkwardly. If you missed it, I'll leave a link to that video in the description. So today, we're checking out the second of the 3 best theist positions. Here's hoping this one's a bit better than the first one. So let's dive in and see what the second best theist position is.
Number 2. I got my notes right here. The fact we haven't blown each other up with nukes. What does that even mean? Like, how do you understand how humans act in every other walk of life? And then you give them these bombs that can immediately win wars. They've been in wars ever since it was invented in 1944, 1945. We've had wars every year somewhere. Obviously, we have 10 going on right now. No one's ever nuked anybody other than those first 2 nukes dropped on Japan.
What does that even mean? But let me take his whole point and try to get it covered entirely, because the answer to this question is a lot more than you'd think. This is going to be a bit of a long part because there's a lot to cover, so strap in. The idea that humans are violent in every other walk of life, so of course nukes should have been used again, is built on a false premise. History since 1945 is not a straight continuation of business as usual. Nuclear weapons fundamentally reshaped global conflict. First, not all wars are equal. Yes, there have been wars every year since World War II, but they weren't global wars. The Second World War saw over 70 million casualties, with entire economies mobilized into total war. Since then, conflicts have mostly been regional or proxy wars: Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the Balkans, Rwanda, Syria, and countless others. Devastating? Yes, but on a fraction of World War II's scale. But why? Because once nuclear weapons entered the picture, the cost of direct conflict between superpowers skyrocketed. The US and the Soviet Union fought indirectly, arming allies, staging coups, funding insurgents, but both avoided a head-on clash. The Cold War wasn't cold because humanity suddenly got nicer. It was cold because direct war risked ending civilization. Historian John Lewis Gaddis put it bluntly: the absence of a direct great power conflict in the second half of the 20th century is the single most important fact about international relations in this period. The shadow of nuclear weapons was this reason. Second, enter deterrence theory. Here is the heart of the matter. It's deterrence. In 1946, Bernard Brodie, one of the founders of nuclear strategy, wrote, "Thus far, the chief purpose of our military establishment has been to win wars. From now on, its chief purpose must be to avert them." And that's deterrence theory in a single sentence. Once both sides have nuclear weapons, no rational leader can use them without ensuring their own destruction. This balance, later called mutually assured destruction, or MAD, means pressing the button was also pressing it on yourself. Take the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. For 13 days, the world teetered on the edge. Soviet missiles were in Cuba. US warheads were aimed back. American generals urged a strike. Instead, Kennedy and Khrushchev backed down, because both knew that once a nuke launched, retaliation would be automatic and millions would die. The crisis wasn't divine intervention, it was political calculation under the logic of deterrence. The irony of nuclear weapons is that the more destructive they are, the less likely that they are to be used. In a twisted way, the absolute horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki is exactly what prevents leaders from repeating them. And speaking of those 2 cities, they were war crimes, not any kind of pragmatism. I want to be absolutely clear about this. Calling Hiroshima and Nagasaki a common sense strategy is grotesque. They were war crimes. Entire civilian populations were targeted. Roughly 140,000 people died in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki. Most of them civilians and many of them children. Survivors described skin melting off in strips. Radiation poisoning haunted them for decades. One Hiroshima victim left nothing more than a shadow burned into some stone steps, still visible today at the Hiroshima Peace Memorial. That's what nuclear pragmatism looks like, a human being reduced to an outline scorched into rock. And even top military leaders condemned it. Eisenhower wrote in his memoirs, Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary. Admiral William Leahy, Truman's own chief of staff, said, in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. These were not anti-American radicals saying this. These were men running the war. So when someone waves away Hiroshima and Nagasaki as pragmatic, they're ignoring the fact that the US deliberately targeted civilians and then justified it because, as the victors, they got to write the history. As historian Howard Zinn pointed out, war crimes are only committed by the losers. The winners get to call theirs necessary. So why haven't nukes been used since? Why hasn't there been another? Well, it seems ATHEIST is heavily implying that it's because of divine restraint. But this just isn't, nor can it be, the case. We know how humans act, and due to this, it's safe to say it's because of human fear, politics, and admittedly, sheer luck. So I'm going to touch on a few points here. Put simply, the logic of mutual destruction prevents first strikes. The nuclear taboo, as scholar Nina Tannenwald calls it, grew stronger over time. Nuclear use became politically unthinkable. And it's not like accidents never happened. We've had dozens of close calls. In 1983, Soviet officer Stavroslav Petrov judged a nuclear alarm was false and refused to report an incoming US strike. He may have saved the world. In 1961, a B-52 broke up over North Carolina, dropping 2 live hydrogen bombs, one safety switch away from detonation. So the claim that nothing ever happened is simply false. Things happened. We survived because of deterrence, restraint, and frankly, luck. So no, the absence of a nuclear war is not some mysterious force. It's not fate. It's not providence. It's not divine hands guiding us away from the button. It's geopolitics. It's deterrence theory. It's near misses and frantic phone calls. It's human beings staring into the abyss and deciding just barely not to jump. And Hiroshima and Nagasaki stand as a permanent monument to why deterrence matters. Because the second we stop taking it seriously, we run the risk of turning shadows on stone into shadows across the entire Earth.
Never been another nuke used in a war. No rogue country. The United States didn't do it for the same reasons as World War II, to stop a war that's going to end up killing more people than the nuke did. There wasn't even pragmatic usage, which means measuring the cost-benefit analysis and it really being commonsensical to use it at that point. Nothing. No nukes. We've got these nukes. We've got everyone pissed off. We've got warfare everywhere. No one's used to nuke. Why is that?
Let's hear that again. No rogue country, no nukes, no pragmatic usage. Why is that? It's not mysterious at all. It's deterrence, yes, but it's also political cost and international diplomacy. If a nuclear weapon were used today, the world wouldn't just shrug and say, pragmatic choice. It would be a political earthquake. The country that launched it would instantly become a pariah, lose allies overnight, and probably face overwhelming retaliation. That's why it hasn't happened. So look at history. During the Korean War, General Douglas MacArthur actually wanted to nuke China. President Truman fired him for even suggesting it. Why? Because dropping another bomb would have destroyed America's credibility with allies, horrified the global public, and risked pushing neutral states into the Soviet camp. In Vietnam, Johnson's advisors floated nuclear options. They were dismissed for the same reason. The military utility couldn't justify the political fallout. And that's what political scientists call the nuclear taboo. Nina Tannenwald describes it as a shared international norm. Nukes aren't just big bombs. They're morally radioactive. Even regimes with no regard for human rights, Stalin's USSR, Mao's China, Kim Jong-un's North Korea, haven't dared use them in war. Not because they're gentle souls, but because they know the global consequences would be catastrophic. And let's be clear, if world leaders acted the way this argument suggests, dropping nukes every time we were pissed off, then there wouldn't be a world left. The Cold War would have turned cities into craters and poisoned the atmosphere decades ago. The only reason that didn't happen isn't divine protection. It's that leaders, however reckless in other ways, understood the political, diplomatic, and existential costs of nuclear use. So, no, the fact that nukes haven't been dropped since 1945 isn't some great mystery. It's the entirely predictable outcome of deterrence, diplomacy, and the heavy price of crossing the nuclear line.
Just from the outside, don't overanalyze this. I'm an expert at not overanalyzing.
Don't worry, ATHEIST. No one would ever accuse you of overanalyzing any point you've made thus far. But it would be great if you at least analyzed your point before you put it out as one of the best positions to convince an atheist. Because so far, it's not looking great.
That's why you're watching.
That's not why I'm watching. I'm watching because you said these were the 3 best positions to convince people like me of theism, I presume.
I could underanalyze a popsicle.
This is probably the most accurate thing he said so far.
So the point is, when you look at the world in terms of military, warfare, conflict globally, when you look at these things, there's actually a term for it, geopolitics, I think.
Yes, there is a term for it, and he is right. And since we're going to use academic words, let's actually define them. Geopolitics is the study of how geography interacts with political power to shape international relations. It's about how physical realities, borders, resources, oceans, mountains, combine with economics, culture, and military strength to determine how nations behave on the world stage. Think of it like this. If politics is the game, then geopolitics is the playing field. It's why Russia cares so much about Ukraine, and why the US has a vested interest in the Pacific, and why countries pour billions into securing trade routes. And yes, it's exactly why nuclear weapons sit at the center of global strategy. Now, he has, and by extension so have I, been talking about geopolitics this entire time. Deterrence theory? That's geopolitics. The nuclear taboo that keeps nations from risking their global reputation? Geopolitics. The cost-benefit analysis of whether a nuke would achieve military goals or trigger catastrophic retaliation? You guessed it, geopolitics. And scholars don't just wave this term around to sound clever. Entire fields of international relations are built on it. For example, Halford Mackender's early 20th century Heartland theory argued that whoever controlled Central Eurasia would dominate global politics. Later, Nicholas Spikeman countered with Rimland theory, focusing on coastal regions. These ideas weren't just any kind of abstract theory, they were influenced by Cold War policy and military strategy. That's geopolitics at work. So yes, this term is absolutely relevant. But here's the important part. If you're gonna drop geopolitics into an argument, you can't toss it in like a garnish on a salad and move on. It's not just a fancy word, it's a serious discipline that helps explain why nuclear weapons have remained unused since 1945. Without it, you're basically ignoring the actual reasons behind this global restraint and pretending the situation is some kind of mystery. But again, credit where credit's due, he's correctly using it, and since he is correctly using it, at least he knows what it means.
I don't even know what that means.
What? Excuse me for a moment. You know, I shouldn't have been surprised, but he got me here. You know, nothing screams credibility like admitting you don't know your own vocabulary.
The point is, no one's used a nuke. It's not that hard to grasp. It should have happened. There should have been accidents. There should have been problems.
There should have been accidents. There should have been problems. Is he seriously saying that we've had no issues since 1945? Well, let's take a look at some major nuclear near misses since 1945. First, as I touched on very briefly, 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is probably the closest we've ever come to having used nuclear weapons. The US and the USSR were on a brink of the nuclear war. A Soviet submarine commander, Vasily Arkhipov, refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch under US pressure. His restraint may have prevented World War III. A second one I touched on earlier, in 1961, the Goldsboro B-52 crash in North Carolina. A US bomber broke apart midair, dropping 2 live hydrogen bombs over North Carolina. One bomb's safety switch failed, and only a single low-voltage switch prevented detonation. A US government report later admitted it could have destroyed much of the East Coast. The other incident I spoke very briefly of was in 1983, the Stanislav Petrov incident in USSR. Soviet early warning systems falsely reported incoming US nuclear missiles. Petrov, the duty officer, judged it was a false alarm and refused to launch a retaliatory strike. If he had followed protocol, it would have likely triggered a full-scale nuclear war. But more in 1979, the NORAD computer glitch in the USA. A training tape was mistakenly loaded into NORAD's computers, making it look like the Soviets had launched a massive strike. US nuclear forces scrambled before the mistake was caught. In 1995, the Norwegian rocket incident in Russia. A scientific rocket launch from Norway was mistaken by Russian radar for a potential US nuclear strike. At that time, President Boris Yeltsin actually opened the nuclear briefcase and considered launching a counterattack before it was identified correctly. In 1980, the Damascus Titan missile explosion in Arkansas. A drop wrench from a socket caused a Titan II missile's fuel tank to rupture, leading to an explosion that blasted its nuclear warhead out of the silo. Thankfully, the warhead didn't detonate, but the event could have been catastrophic. But those seem like such a long time ago, right? All of those are older than I am. So something more recently. In 2007, the Mina Air Force Base accident in the USA. 6 live nuclear warheads were mistakenly loaded onto a B-52 and flown to Louisiana, going undetected for about 36 hours. So I don't know about you, but I would count all of these as accidents or problems.
There isn't enough problems associated with the rise of the nuclear weapon in whatever form, whether it's this large ballistic missile, whether it's a tactical nuke. Nothing. Zero. And I'm not saying, knock on wood, I hope no one uses it. That's not my point. I think we should end all these stupid wars for nothing because they're dumb.
So apparently the grand argument is wars are dumb? Well, thank you, modern day Aristotle, for that penetrating insight. Here's the thing. Wars don't happen because leaders think, well, this'll be fun. They happen because of power struggles and land grabs and resources and taxes and religious authority and plain old human greed. Reducing all of that to dumb is like calling gravity annoying. Well, it's not wrong, but it is missing the point. Look at the world as it is, not as we wish it were. In this reality, Putin invades Ukraine. In this reality, nations fight back when their sovereignty is threatened. In this reality, governments clash over resources and borders and influence. And the United States, the supposed paragon of restraint, it's been knee-deep in conflicts from Korea to Iraq to Afghanistan. You can argue over whether each was justified, but you can't just wave them all away as dumb without ignoring the stakes for millions of people. Would it be great if wars didn't happen? Well, of course. But pretending they're just stupid mistakes misses why they keep happening. As long as there are overly ambitious leaders and greedy governments, wars will still exist. And the irony is, if wars really were as dumb as he claims, then nuclear deterrence, the very reason nukes haven't been used, wouldn't even work. Because deterrence depends on nations acting rationally in their own interests. So no, this isn't some powerful argument. At best, it's a shrug that he seems to pretend is a deep philosophy. And if that's the best defense for divine intervention, well, let's just say the bar isn't set very high. So what is the point?
The point is nukes. That was really sophisticated, wasn't it? No one's used a nuke. That's a pretty powerful argument when you look at it rationally, when you separate it from the scientific scientism that overanalyzes everything. You don't need to overanalyze it. No one's used it. Except those two, nothing.
Scientific scientism. Now that's a phrase. What does that even mean? Is there also unscientific scientism? Or maybe a deluxe edition? Scientism now with extra science? Honestly, it sounds like the kind of thing you'd hear from a conspiracy theorist who ran out of synonyms halfway through a rant. But underneath the nonsense wording is a more serious problem. What he's really saying is, don't overanalyze it, which, let's be honest, is code for don't analyze it at all. That's not wisdom, that's intellectual laziness dressed up as some kind of profundity. And here's the reality. The only reason nuclear weapons haven't been used since 1945 is because people have analyzed them exhaustively. Military strategists built deterrence theory around them. Politicians signed arms control treaties because they analyzed the risks. Even accidents, like the previously mentioned Goldsboro incident and the Stanislav Petrov near miss, taught us just how close the world has come to catastrophe. We know all of this because people didn't shrug and say, no need to overthink it. They studied, debated, and wrestled with the consequences. If you strip away the analysis, all you're left with is blind luck. And I don't know about you, but I'd rather not gamble civilization on whether someone's common sense holds up during a crisis. So when he waves away analysis as unnecessary, it's not just sloppy, it's dangerous. Because the moment we stop analyzing nuclear risks is the moment we stop preventing them.
How? Something's keeping us from doing it, or there's some force or there's some fated situation. I'm not saying I believe any of this stuff. What I'm telling you is these are arguments. That's number 2.
Okay, so we've reached the actual conclusion of his argument/position. Let me see if I can condense it all in a way everyone can understand. Given humanity's long history of violence, conquest, and escalation of war, it's surprising that nuclear weapons, the most destructive weapons ever created, have not been used since 1945. The likelihood of accidents, miscalculations, or deliberate attacks should have made their use almost inevitable by now. Yet, against all odds, it hasn't happened. The best explanation for that is some sort of higher power or guiding force preventing it. So, in a more formal structure, his position seems to go like this. Premise 1. Nuclear weapons exist. Premise 2. Nukes are highly destructive and could decisively end wars. Premise 3. Humans fight wars constantly. Premise 4. Despite this, nukes haven't been used since 1945. Conclusion 1. Therefore, something must be stopping us, some force or fate. Conclusion 2. That force is God. So I suppose we can basically call this the argument from nuclear restraint? And if anyone has a stronger form for this argument, I am interested. So let's look at some problems with this argument. First, it's an argument from ignorance fallacy. Just because we don't know why something hasn't happened doesn't mean we can insert God as the explanation. We don't know why X, therefore God, is a classic God of the gaps argument. It also ignores stronger explanations. We do know why nukes haven't been used. Deterrence theory, mutual assured destruction, international diplomacy, and the immense political and moral costs. These are robust, historically documented explanations that don't require invoking divine intervention. Baked in the entire argument is confirmation bias. If nukes had been used, would that disprove God? Likely not. The argument only works because reality happens to line up with his preferred interpretation. That's a selective reading of history. Then there's this false premise about inevitability. He assumes nukes should have been used by now, but that's not necessarily true. Many weapons, chemical, biological weapons for instance, also exist and are rarely used because of norms, treaties, and deterrence. That doesn't require divine restraint either. So when he says something's keeping us from doing it, the answer is clear. Deterrence, politics, diplomacy, human morality, and yes, blind luck. But I don't see any room for divine intervention. And here's the kicker. If nukes had been used since 1945, would that disprove God? Well, of course not. Believers would just say, God allowed it for mysterious reasons. So no matter what happens, nukes used or not used, the conclusion is always God. And that's not any kind of reasoning, that's rigging the game. So let's be honest. What's really stopping us from nuclear Armageddon isn't some inevitable hands from the heavens. It's us, our fear, our diplomacy, our calculations, and our very human ability to stare into the abyss and say, not today. And frankly, that explanation is more rational, more grounded, and far more awe-inspiring than shrugging and saying, oh, it must have been God. And I can't let this go without addressing that little disclaimer he slips in.
I'm not saying I believe any of this stuff. What I'm telling you is these are arguments.
That's awkward to say the least. If you don't believe your own argument, why are you presenting it as if it's serious? It's like showing up to a debate with cue cards that read, these aren't my views, but they sounded cool in the shower. Now maybe he means he's just putting ideas on the table, which would be fair enough. But if you notice, he's presenting these points as though they're genuinely persuasive, and he tells us something important. Either he does think they're strong arguments, which speaks volumes about his standards of reasoning, or he's knowingly throwing out arguments he himself doesn't buy, and neither option screams academic rigor. It's like a lawyer standing up in court and saying, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I don't believe my client's innocent either, but hey, here's a theory I found on Reddit. Not exactly confidence-inspiring. And that's the end of position 2. Now, I just gave the whole position in its strongest form I could manage, so I'm not going to summarize the video today. I think even in the strongest form I could manage, it's still pretty rough. But what do you think? Do you find this argument is a strong position for theists to take? Or were the holes just too glaring? Let me know in the comments. Overall, I give this position a 10 facepalmy Mr. Jesuses out of 10, a perfect score. He admits he doesn't fully understand terms like geopolitics and leans into, I don't analyze things. That, I'll call it honesty, is surface level, but it also reveals he's not grappling with the actual historical, political, or psychological reasons for nuclear deterrence, like mutually assured destruction, treaties, international norms, risk aversion, etc. He suggests that common sense dictates nukes should have been used, but doesn't back that up with evidence. That's more like a rhetorical assertion than good faith reasoning. He does leave himself some wiggle room by saying, "I'm not saying I believe this, I'm just saying it's an argument." That's a shield against critique, which lowers intellectual honesty. He gives no historical analysis of nuclear strategy, deterrence theory, Cold War dynamics, non-proliferation treaties, or the political cost of nuclear use. There is zero engagement with actual academic work in political science or history. He relies entirely on credulity, "it should have happened but it didn't," as the sole foundation. And he explicitly dismisses analysis as scientism, cringe, and prides himself on not overanalyzing. That is blatantly anti-academic. That's it for this one. So now, what do you think? Did you find ATHEIST convincing here? Or was my takedown too much for the position to handle? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this kind of takedown, let me and the YouTubes know by hitting that like button. Though on the subject of not too much, you can ensure you get more of my content delivered to your YouTubes by hitting that subscribe button if you haven't already. Though, speaking of people I can't thank too much, I need to give a never enough thanks to my patrons, especially Calamus, Anima, and Sora, who are the running start to taking down bad arguments/positions for my channel. If you would like to be a full head of steam, you can do what everyone here on screen has done for as low as a single $1 a month and head on over to patreon.com/darkofalltrades. But even if you can't, for whatever reason, support the channel this way, there are plenty of little things that go a long way. Liking, subscribing, sharing a video with your friends or enemies, commenting, joining the Discord, all of these help the channel more than you think. For everyone that does, thank you. Sincerely, it means a lot that you support me and the countless hours of work that go into all my content. So as a bonus thanks, here's a little bonus. Now, I didn't really touch too heavily on it in the video, but I want to clear up this claim that there wasn't even a pragmatic use for nukes. Because there absolutely has been, just not in the way he pictures it. Think about North Korea. For decades now, they've carried out nuclear tests, not because they needed to vaporize an enemy, but because they wanted the world to know that they could. Those mushroom clouds underground were never military necessity. They were political theater. And they worked. Every test has forced the US, China, South Korea, and Japan to the table. Every test has reminded the world, ignore us at your peril. And it's not just rogue states doing this. The United States in the 1950s ran a whole series of highly publicized atmospheric nuclear tests, some literally televised, partly as Cold War intimidation. When you can detonate a multi-megaton bomb in the Pacific, knowing the Soviets are watching, it's not just science. That's muscle flexing. It's saying, look at the size of our arsenal and think twice before you move. Even the Soviets played this game. Khrushchev's massive 1961 detonation of the Tsar Bomba, the largest nuclear device ever tested, was never meant for battlefield use. It was too big, too impractical. It was a demonstration, a geopolitical stunt. We can build the biggest bomb in history. Don't test us. That's what we call nuclear signaling, a deliberate act where the test itself becomes the weapon. No one had to die for it to be effective. The bang doesn't need to flatten a city. It just needs to echo through foreign ministries and stock markets. Nuclear weapons have been pragmatically used for decades, not as bullets, but as bargaining chips. That's the difference between hard power, firing the actual bomb, and soft power, showing you're ready to. Both are uses, both shape history. To pretend that none of that counts is like saying a gun isn't used unless it fires and kills someone, even if it's been waved in someone's face to get what the wielder wants. By that logic, every hostage situation, every holdup, every robbery in history where no one was shot necessarily would have to be noted as doesn't involve the use of a gun, which is absurd. So no, nuclear weapons haven't sat on the shelf gathering dust since 1945. They've been used strategically, politically, and coercively. And ignoring that is either a misunderstanding of history or a refusal to look at how power really works in a modern world. So thanks for hanging out with me to the end. I know this video is a bit tougher to tough through, so if you made it this far, good job, you're tougher than many. I appreciate that you made it, and I hope to have the third of 3 out next week. So be on the lookout for that, be ready, and as always, keep learning.
that.